Thank you, Klaus.
Yes, thank you. Morning, sir. How are you?
Fine, sir.
How long have you been in law enforcement?
Since 1992,
Okay. Pretty much a career for you?
it is.
And do you enjoy doing what you do?
Very much.
Did you get any college training or anything before going to the police academy?
Well, not before the police academy. I had, right out of high school, I went into the Army. I was in the U.S. Army Infantry, and when I got out, I then applied directly to the Daytona Beach Community College Police Academy.
Completed that and then been in law enforcement ever since?
Correct.
And you've discussed your career with George Zimmerman, have you not?
In detail.
And it was actually you who assisted him when he decided that he needed a firearm, correct?
That is correct.
And did he tell you the reason why he wanted to get a firearm?
He asked whether he should or shouldn't to start with,
Okay.
and I recommended that he should, that anybody who's a non-convicted felon should carry a firearm.
That's your sort of life philosophy?
That's my opinion, correct.
Being armed is better than not being armed?
The police aren't always there.
And you then encouraged him to do that?
I told him if he wished to go to a place that actually trains for the concealed weapons permit and to get that training.
Which you know that he did, right?
He did do.
And that he actually got his concealed weapons permit?
I believe him and his wife.
Okay. And then they need to decide what weapon that they should or he should purchase, correct?
That is correct.
And did he seek your counsel in that regard?
He did.
And
Object is to beyond the scope of direct.
Sustained.
okay. Let's focus then a bit more. How long did you know George?
About 5 years, or at that time it was about 4 years at that time.
Okay. And I think you said he's your best friend?
Best one I've ever had.
Would that affect in any way your testimony here today, that he's a good friend of yours?
Well, not as far as the truth is.
Okay. So you're going to speak the truth, good or bad, for Mrs. Zimmerman?
Correct.
And as part of that friendship, you were contacted on the night that this event happened?
I was.
Okay. And offered your help, went and I guess helped Shelley, who was going through what she was going through, right?
Near hysterical. She had called me she was visiting her father's home at the time when she received a call from a neighbor from Twin Lakes, and then she immediately called me. And both of us got into our vehicle and arrived at Twin Lakes about within 10 seconds of each other.
And how upset was she?
Indescribably hysterical. She had almost no information to go on because the neighbor, I guess, that called, they had to hang up. So she couldn't get further updates as to George's health or status or what he had. She was, I put my arm around her just to kind of keep her from blacking out, I guess.
Because at that point, she had gotten a phone call from somebody who actually said that George was involved in a shooting, correct?
She told me that she got a call that said George was involved in a shooting, in handcuffs and bloody.
So you arrive at the area, the complex where it happened, meet with Shelley.
Correct.
Did you see George at that point?
We walked up to where the yellow crime scene tape was that was surrounding. It was a massive area that they had circled off, so we couldn't get very close to the actual scene itself. But inside the crime scene tape was a Stanford police officer car. In the back seat of the police officer car, Shelley and I saw someone who she more quickly identified as probably being George lean his head down and lay down from the back seat. And he supposedly he had laid straight down to where no one could see him.
And did you have any contact with him at that point?
None. Couldn't get anywhere close.
Okay. Then at some point, you went to Sanford Police Department, correct?
Correct. I drove Shelley over to the Sanford Police Department, and we waited in their lobby until he was released.
Do you recall about how many hours you were there?
Goodness. 2 or 3 a.m., could have been even longer.
What was his state of mind when you finally saw him at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning?
Stunned. He immediately attempted to reassure Shelley, who broke down again once she saw him. Once they got out of the elevator, she went into hysterics, kind of a breakdown, maybe not hysterics, but went into a sobbing breakdown. And he immediately tried to reassure her he was okay, and so he was more occupied with her than with anything else. But he had a stunned look on his face.
And when you say stunned, tell me.
Wide-eyed, just kind of a little bit detached, perhaps from maybe not realizing he had just gone through a traumatic event. Kind of odd to describe, very, very difficult to describe it.
Let's talk about, obviously, as a good friend for him for the 5 years prior, or 4 years prior, you've known him, correct?
Oh, yes.
And then tell the jury, if you would, how he was that night compared to the George Zimmerman you knew most other days.
That's what I was using to base my observation on, was a more wide-eyed stare. Again, once he saw Shelley, he focused more on making sure she was reassured and that letting her know that he's okay, he doesn't have anything fatal or anything going on with him. He's all right. And she immediately started to observe. Once she got out of her shock at seeing George, she then started kind of looking at his injuries, and I guess she kind of went into nurse mode at that point because she was a nursing student.
And again, how is George presenting himself to you?
Detached. It's hard to describe.
Well, is detached different from the way he normally is?
Oh, vastly.
So when you say detached, what do you mean?
I would say probably when you feel like it's hard to describe, sir. I would say he was probably in a position where he was not able to process. His mind wasn't, he wasn't answering questions, because I started asking him some questions about whether he needed to sit down for a little bit, right there in the lobby, and he didn't. He just, no, I just want to go home kind of thing. And it was very basic. I don't know how to really describe detached, as in wide-eyed and really not processing what was going on.
Did he seem to you to be non-emotional about what was going on?
Coming right off of the elevator, he was tending to Shelley and her sobbing and her crying. So he was focused with that. When that went down, when Shelley actually transformed from a wife concerned for her husband to being a nurse, that's when he kind of just kind of had a blank stare.
And then at some point you guys got in the car, correct?
Went to my vehicle, correct.
And then let's talk about the conversations that he did have with you. So give us the setting, if you would, as to how this conversation that at some point in the future you relayed as far as your direct examination. So sort of give us the setting for what happened.
Okay. We get into my vehicle. Both Shelley and George got into the back seat. I had a four-door vehicle. They both got in the back seat, and Shelley is trying to put an assessment on the injuries that were to George's nose, the back of his head, and he had a swelling on his left side of his head. It was about what size of your fist. It was a swollen area, not really a goose egg, not as pronounced as that, but it was a very big swollen area. I'm sorry. And with his head being his hair being closely cropped like mine, you could see it very well. I guess if he had a lot more hair, he would not have been able to see it as well. But she started tending to that, stating that we needed to get ice on it and such. And when we got stating that she needed to get ice on that part of the swelling, and on the drive from the Sanford Police Department to my home, he explained from start to finish. It took about the whole time that we went from the Sanford Police Department to my home. He explained what had happened that night, because that was the first time we had known any details of anything.
Now, as he was explaining it to you, was this sort of as a friend recounting to a friend, or were you acting in law enforcement mode or as friend mode?
Well, my wife will tell you it's hard for me to get out of law enforcement mode sometimes, but I like to analyze everything I hear to make sure that it makes sense. But I would say part of his friend also.
Okay. So let's start off then, not to belabor too much with keeping in mind your direct testimony, but let's start with, he first told you he was on his way to Super Target?
Correct.
Did that seem usual or unusual to you?
Every single Sunday like clockwork.
And tell me what he said to you about him first noticing who later became known to all of us as Trayvon Martin.
He observed Trayvon walking between two sets of townhomes and looking into, I believe there was a window to one where the light was on, and you could see that someone was looking into the window of a townhome. And it was about that time that Trayvon and George made eye contact with each other, and both aware of the other's presence.
Okay. And in that initial contact, did he seem to you as though he was angry or anything like that with who this person was?
No. George said that he wanted to make sure that he just got with non-emergency dispatch and had them send a police officer.
And he told you he did that?
Immediately.
And of course, you know from your conversation with George that that entire conversation was recorded, correct?
Yes, I do.
And from your conversations with George, both about this night and other nights, George Zimmerman certainly knows that those phone calls are recorded, correct?
Yes.
So tell me then, again, he's explained to you that Trayvon Martin is now walking up and sort of near his vehicle at some point?
Correct. Came walking from between the townhomes down to where the sidewalk or the road area was.
And are you taking any notes at this point, or are you just listening to him download?
I'm driving.
Okay. So at some point it became apparent to you that Mr. Zimmerman had stopped his car by the clubhouse, correct?
Yes, he did.
And that Trayvon Martin then came up towards his car, either looked in a window or walked partially around it?
Very close, walked around it, very close. They made eye contact several more times, very aware of each other's presence.
During this point, this sort of second eye contact, did George Zimmerman relate to you in any way that he was angry or anything about Trayvon Martin or this person who was there?
No, not at all.
And he further told you that he was still on the phone, of course, with non-emergency, right?
He remained on, correct.
So then we move forward to, I think you said that George Zimmerman did what he thought he should to keep Trayvon Martin in sight?
Correct.
Is that pretty much the way? Tell me how he related that part to you, as best you can recall.
Well, he said that he had heard from the Sanford police officers that showed up to the clubhouse to give instruction to neighborhood watch people was to always try to keep whatever subject that you're observing in sight. It makes it much easier for a law enforcement officer to show up and make contact with the subject if you're on the phone with dispatch during the whole process and you can actually see the subject.
Did he relate to you that the non-emergency dispatcher had actually told him on a couple of occasions, tell me what he's doing now or let me know if he's doing anything else?
He told me what he was doing. He didn't tell me that the dispatcher had said certain things.
Okay. So basically, George Zimmerman, as he's telling you this story, is recounting to you actions, correct?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Not necessarily, I did this because of this reason, or I did this, and sort of superimposing the conversation he's having with the non-emergency onto your conversation.
No, not at that time, no.
Okay. He was just saying basically a rendition of what was going on.
Correct.
And just so the jury is clear, about how long was this conversation between George Zimmerman and you during this car ride?
The drive from the Sanford Police Department to near the intersection of Reinhardt Road and Lake Mary Boulevard, which would have been about 14 minutes, 15 minutes.
And during that time, were other things being discussed as well, like whatever Shelley was doing with him?
She didn't interject at all.
Okay. So during this conversation then, he's telling you that he's trying to keep an eye on Trayvon Martin however he can.
That was his intent,
Okay.
was to keep him under observation.
And at some point, well, tell me then, at some point did he say to you that I couldn't see him any longer, or that he lost sight of him?
That is one of the reasons why he got out of the vehicle.
And tell me how he related that to you?
He said he went in between the sets of townhomes down a dog path, a walking path.
When you say he, you mean Trayvon Martin?
What? Right. He lost contact in the darkness in between the townhomes down that walking path, and then he got out of his vehicle it may have been at the time when someone was asking him, where's your exact location, because the officer was getting close. So as the police officer gets closer and closer to the actual scene, the dispatch likes to tell them exact street numbers so you can find your place exactly.
Okay.
So that's what he was looking for.
George Zimmerman never told you during the entire of this conversation that George Zimmerman ever went down the dog path, correct?
He did. He left his vehicle and he
walked down the path.
Walked down the path, correct.
Do you know this area that we're talking about?
I do.
Okay. You know there's a path that goes straight through to a Retreat View Circle?
Correct.
And then a right turn that goes off to the right?
Correct.
A T.
Yes.
And he had said to you that Trayvon Martin went down the T, correct?
Perhaps, yes. That's what he believes, because the street beyond was lit better than the dog path was. So if Trayvon had gone all the way to Retreat View Circle, he would have seen him or his shadow, perhaps. Because he lost sight of him around the time where the T was, he said, I believe he made his turn down that dark dog path area that was not very well lit at all.
And tell us the path, if you recall, that George Zimmerman told you he took as he was on the phone.
He said he went straight to go through since he lost contact. He wanted to go straight through to get a house number of one of the... Straight through, not take the right to go down on the T, just to go straight through and find some kind of a house number, because you want to make sure you get the exact house number, because there was a lot of units there on Retreat View Circle. The exact house number would have brought the police officer faster. I believe that's what his intent was.
And he told you he was on his way back when the altercation began, correct?
Correct.
And that they said whatever they said to each other that you testified to. Just to fast forward, I think you said that you weren't taking notes during that event, correct?
I was driving, correct.
Have you ever talked to George again about the facts of this case, or was that the only time?
One other time, I heard him relay the incident.
And when was that?
The next morning.
Okay, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
During the event in the car, when he said things like, do you have a problem, you do now, or no, I don't, are those, as best you can recall, the words that George told you he remembers from the night before?
That is correct.
And talking about the actual mounting, when he said that Trayvon Martin had mounted him, I think he said that at one point he was straddling and the knees may have been up as high as the armpits. Is that correct?
Could have been. The ribs area could have been as high as the armpits.
Well, no, I'm just asking you, because what I would like to do is have you tell the jury, without presuming or suggesting ribs, armpits, hips, knees, whatever it might be, for right now, just recount, as best you recall, what George remembered of the event and what he told you.
Well, I guess during the struggle, I guess the position of his knees and legs would probably change with George squirming. So at one point, I believe they were around his ribs, with George trying to squirm off of the sidewalk and onto the grass. I guess his knees came up a little higher, and that's very possible. Or the other way around, to where it was as he's squirming, once they get closer to the grass, in a fight, I guess, or in a scrap like that, it began at least here with the ribs. where the knees are somewhere in the ribs area.
Was he consistent, however, that it was Trayvon Martin who had mounted on top of him?
If it was Trayvon
Was it-
that did
yes.
it? Oh, absolutely.
And was he consistent that it was he, meaning George Zimmerman, who was screaming for help?
Without question.
And he did tell you at some point that there was some hand over the nose, hand over the mouth event.
Correct. But it was raining and it was slippery, I'm sure.
Did he tell you how long that portion of the overall altercation lasted?
20 seconds maybe, 15, 20, 30 seconds?
Did he-
He didn't mention it.
Well, again, I don't want you to
No, he didn't mention
assume.
it. He did not say how long.
Okay. Did that, however, as he related it to you, seem to be significant as it was occurring to him, that he couldn't breathe for whatever length of time?
It was critical.
And that somebody had a hand, Trayvon Martin, on the nose that had already suffered the previous injury?
Correct.
And as he was relating that to you, was that sort of a real focus of his?
That was the focus. When he was losing oxygen, he felt he was not able to breathe, and that's why he was desperate to either clear an airway.
And in your experience as law enforcement, would you agree that that's sort of a natural reaction to traumatic events?
I would think so, every time I've seen it.
And do people involved in traumatic events like that sometimes focus on particular parts of it?
Almost exclusively to the omission of others.
For example, in a car accident, you might focus on the speed of the car coming at you and completely forget about other cars around you.
Correct.
Is that unnatural in your experience as law enforcement?
No, it's typical.
So when you go to a scene of an accident or shooting or just anything that you investigate, do you find in your experience that people often have sort of tunnel vision views of what happened to them?
Sometimes very specific, correct.
Does that mean that they're lying to you when they do that?
Not at all.
Why not?
It's been proven that is typical. Sometimes they'll focus in on one event to the exclusion of others.
How about their ability to just recount events with any particularity at all?
I'm going to object this beyond the scope of direct. I haven't objected previously.
And then you testified concerning this whole event around the gun. Did you have a similar concern as to Mrs. Zimmerman's ability to recount those events to you?
No.
Okay. Tell me what he did say about having to grab his gun.
He said that Trayvon had reached down and grabbed for the gun, whether it was on the leather holster or on the actual metal part itself. At the time, I didn't see a difference. I just thought that the intent was clear, and that's when he freed one of his hands and went and got the gun. He either broke contact or knocked somebody else's hand away, or Trayvon's hand away from him reaching for the gun or grabbing the gun, and then he drew it.
Do you recall if he even told you that Trayvon Martin had touched the gun, or just that he was reaching for it?
I thought he had said he had grabbed the gun. I've only heard the story twice, and whether it was grabbed the gun, grabbed for the gun, perhaps it was just the intent. But I believed he said he grabbed the gun.
So, and then he told you the rest of the story as you related, correct?
Yes, sir.
About Trayvon Martin sort of saying something to him. Did that seem unusual to you, that someone shot could still say something?
Yes. Oh no, that's very, very common. Unless you're shot in, let's say, the windpipe and in the vocal cords, you would be able to talk for maybe 6 to 8 seconds.
Nonetheless, that George Zimmerman said that he had gotten off and actually held his hands out away from his body?
He had gotten off of George, laid down on the grass, and George had jumped on top of him to pin his hands down. and to, again, try to solicit some help from people that are around.
And yet, when he let the hands go, Trayvon Martin may have brought them back under him? Was that the way it was presented to you?
No.
Speculation.
Oh, yeah.
I apologize for withdrawal.
Yeah, no.
Did he even did George Zimmerman even know to talk to you about the fact that Trayvon Martin's hands were found back under his body?
I did not know that fact.
Okay. So he didn't seem to feel any need to explain that away to you, correct?
Correct.
So now let's talk about your recounting this. Well, you said that you heard a story again the next day.
Next morning.
Any differences in what we've talked about so far?
None.
Okay. And who was that discussed with or in front of?
My wife and his wife, Shelley.
And was it different in any context when it was being discussed then?
It was, George looked different. He was not as wide-eyed, and he did not appear to be as in shock the next morning.
Now, let's fast forward. How many months until you decided to recount this in a book form?
I may have to look. At least 4 months.
Okay. Did you have any conversation with Mr. Zimmerman to corroborate that what you recalled happened or what you recall him telling you happened was in fact accurate?
We were not able to contact each other after he was arrested the first time. So there was no contact.
All right. And so you haven't talked to him, you haven't shown him, for example, a draft of the book and say, I remember you saying this, and him saying, no, that I said this instead.
There was no cooperation with that, no.
Yeah. This is your memory 4 months later when you looked back to that night, correct?
Correct.
And just remember as best you can 4 months later.
Correct.
You didn't take any notes that night
No.
or in between, did you?
No.
So it wasn't until 4 months later that you went back, sort of scoured your memory to put back together what he had told you on that night, 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th.
Unfortunately, I did not take any notes, so it was just memory.
If you had any facts wrong that were conclusively proven wrong by forensic evidence, would you defer to the evidence rather than your memory of it?
Without question.
If, for example, he told you he shot once and there were 4 shots fired, and you had in your book that there was 1, but the forensic evidence supported 4, you would defer to that?
I'd support that 100%.
And to the extent that he may have told you something, or you remember he told you something differently than it appears in the non-emergency call, which is recorded contemporaneous with the event, you would defer to that?
Absolutely. I may have heard wrong, or I may have documented it wrong.
And even if there was something different that he told law enforcement a few hours earlier in a recorded or videotaped interview from what you recall happening, would you defer to that?
I would.
A moment, Your Honor. And at some point during this investigation, you had an opportunity to listen to the screaming on the 911 call, correct?
Beyond the scope of direct.
Sustained.
Didn't know other questions from you.
Can you redirect?
You, as best you could, have testified and have written in your book what the defendant, your best friend, George Zimmerman, told you, correct?
Correct.
You haven't made anything up to help one side or the other, is that correct?
None whatsoever.
And as you stated, the defendant never told you that the victim had his hands underneath his body after he shot him. He said he put his hands out, right?
Correct.
And as you stated, the defendant told you that the victim, Trayvon Martin, grabbed his gun, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Grabbed for his gun.
Well, I think you've actually,
Grabbed, right. Whether it was, again, where I guess we're going over whether it grabbed the holster part or the gun, I didn't see a difference in the two. But grabbed something.
grabbed the gun. He didn't.
Absolutely. The gun didn't come out. but
No.
he grabbed the gun in the holster.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes, sir.
The defendant didn't tell you, Mr. Zimmerman didn't tell you he grabbed four, he said he actually got it.
That's what I heard, that's what I thought I heard, yes.
Right, okay. Then he told you, I thought I shot wide, but he might get up, so I put my gun in my holster.
Correct.
And he said he put the phone in his pocket, turned around to head back, and the guy was right there about 15 feet walking towards him.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very brief, one question response. As to the reholstering of the weapon, do you recall if he told you that it was reholstered as he got up, if he had it in his hand when he was holding Trayvon Martin's hands down, or even at some point shortly thereafter?
He may have had it still in his hand as he jumped on top of Trayvon and perhaps holstered when he saw the flashlight. I don't remember specifically when exactly he holstered his firearm.
Thank you. Nothing further on.
Will we redirect?
You wrote in the book that he holstered his firearm.
He holstered his firearm at some point. Exactly when, I'm not 100% sure whether it was when he got up from, whether he stood up and reholstered, or whether he holstered while still partially on top.
Right, you want to look at your book a minute, if you could, page 29 at the bottom. Did you quote him as saying, in fact, I thought he might try to get up again, so after putting my gun in my holster, I jumped on top of him and pinned his wrist to the ground?
Correct.
Okay,
What-
was that accurate?
As far as I remember, that he holstered, yeah, at that point, it now remembers that, I remember that it was, he holstered, pinned his hands down. It's what I remembered him saying something like that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. May Mr. Osterman be excused?
To remain under our subpoena, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. You're excused from the courtroom, but you're subject to being recalled. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take a recess for lunch. Before you go to lunch, I'm going to advise you that during lunch, you're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. You're not to read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case. You're not to go on the internet by using any type of an electronic device to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or a terminology. And finally, you're not to read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case. Do I have your assurances that you will abide by these instructions? Okay, thank you. And with that, put your notepads face down and follow Deputy Jarvis into the jury room. I didn't say what time we were going to come back, so it'll be 1:30. Anything we need to take up before we recess for lunch? Okay, thank you all very much. We'll be at recess till 1:30.